Hello and welcome to episode 12 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast where I speak to the authors of some of our most talked about recent pieces. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. Coming up this week, I speak to Ben Sixsmith, online editor at the Critic, on Keir Starmer's miserabilist plan to ban smoking outside pubs.
It's not a matter of necessity that they're creating these policies. It's more that it's become just a stick to beat people with.
Len Shackleton, Professor of Economics at Buckingham University and a Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs, on an equal pay ruling against Next that spells disaster for British business.
Discrimination is taken almost as synonymous with any difference of outcome. And that, I think, is a very dangerous sort of situation.
Reverend Doctor Bernard Randall, on how he's been persecuted by the Church of England for delivering a sermon in line with Christian doctrine, and how he's fighting back.
They reported to me to prevent the anti-terror watchdog and to the local authority designated officer for safeguarding. I was just so desperately disappointed in the way the church has handled this or failed to handle this.
And for those of you donating £5 or more to the Daily Sceptic, our bonus interview this week is with Alan Halsall, a leading volunteer in the Vote Leave campaign, on how his life was made a misery by the Electoral Commission because he campaigned for Brexit.
I paid hundreds of thousands of pounds, and I was a volunteer. We had to ask people, can you give us some money? Because we had Vote Leave lawyers, and then when the police got involved, I had to have my own criminal lawyers.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month to the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Things will get worse, said Keir Starmer last week in his State of the Nation speech in the Downing Street Garden. A grim message from the leader of the country. And as if to ram the point home, we also learnt last week about Labour's plans to ban smoking outside pubs, restaurants and other venues, in what critics have said would be a major blow to an already struggling hospitality sector. So, not only does our government seem to have no idea how to make our lives better, it also seems to want to take away life's little pleasures too. So what's going on here? Why is Keir Starmer so relentlessly miserable? Well, to talk about that, I'm very pleased to be joined by someone who's considerably less ill-humoured, and that's Ben Sixsmith, online editor at The Critic and author of the Zone substack. Welcome to The Sceptic, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
Now, of course, this smoking ban does speak to a mindset that's become quite pervasive in recent years, which is especially since lockdown, and that's a kind of public health safetyism. And the idea that if you can extend people's lives in any way, then that's a good thing, no matter the knock-on effects. And with the way that smoking is talked about as this kind of scourge these days, it's easy to forget that some people actually do like doing this. Now, I know you've written a bit about this, Ben, and so I want to ask you perhaps the most controversial question I've ever asked anyone on The Sceptic, and that's, what's the case, not the public health case, not the hospitality case even, but what's almost the joy of life case for smoking?
So I'm going to be a little bit cowardly, and I'm not going to fully bite the bullet here. If there was an 18-year-old who came up to me and said, Ben, should I start smoking? I'm not going to say absolutely dive in. I would say probably not. I mean, Christopher Hitchens wrote beautifully about cigarettes. He also probably died because he was such a heavy smoker of cigarettes. But that doesn't mean that there aren't good things to be said about the habit. It can be very pro-social. The Critic yesterday, or on Sunday, we had a beautiful article from a writer called Rose Liddon talking about how much smoking can bring people together, this kind of journey outside of the pub or outside of the restaurant, this exchanging of cigarettes and lighters. I know a lot of my dear friends, a lot of people I've had relationships with in the past, we kind of bonded while smoking, not necessarily just because of the act of smoking, but because of the act of just coming together in this small shared commonality. And as much as, the world will carry on much the same and slightly healthier if people voluntarily choose to give up this habit in the future, I think this kind of top-down coercive pressure to give up smoking is going to disrupt people's social existences as they're forming these relationships. It's going to be another reason people aren't going to go out to pubs, to nightclubs, and they're not going to form these relationships to begin with. And this is in a time where We're seeing more alienation. We're seeing more loneliness. We're seeing fewer romantic relationships being created. We're seeing fewer children being had. And this is just another reason for people not to meet. And I think the kind of social knock-on effects of this could be substantially worse than the health outcomes that it might produce.
Absolutely. And on that question of the social effects, I mean, obviously, that for most people would be a lifestyle choice that they could make or not make. And a traditional understanding of English liberty would say, well, that's up to an individual to decide whether or not they want to do that. And of course, today, people very much understand the dangers of smoking. In fact, only 13% of people do now smoke, and the number has been falling for a long time. And so given that, you'd think that the crusade against smoking might abate a bit, but nevertheless it continues completely unabated. So what does that say about the almost changing understanding of English liberty?
Yeah, I mean, I think people will manufacture excuses for why they can argue that smoking is something which has so many effects on people who don't smoke. There's a lot of fear-mongering about secondhand smoke, the risks of which I think are pretty majorly overblown. People will complain about the smell as if there aren't so many places in public that you can go which are completely free of cigarettes. I'm someone who actively enjoyed the smoking ban. I can empathise with people who don't want to smell it inside a pub, and I quite like going outside of the pub. It makes a nice change. But when there are so many avenues that you can take where you never have to see or have the prolonged smell of a cigarette, it seems ridiculous to complain about other people doing so somewhere else. I think there's just this kind of pressure to make people conform to the particular health standards of the time. And especially when it's increasingly a minority, it's easier to, I'm going to steal a kind of lefty phrase here, and easier to punch down on the people who are still outposts of smoking loyalism than it is to confront some of the other unhealthy standards we have related to food consumption, for example. And I think people just like meddling, to be honest. There is this tradition of liberty in England, but as we saw so much during the coronavirus lockdowns, a lot of people just like hassling other people. There's a kind of pleasure to telling other people what to do. There's a kind of pleasure to informing on people. There's definitely a pleasure to judging people. And this kind of busybody culture, I think, there's a significant element to which is an influence here.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned the potential impact on hospitality. And of course, another thing that will really be bad news for pubs is potential mooted plans for bringing in alcohol minimum pricing. Now, do you get the sense that this is a deliberate attack on the great British boozer, or is this more just incidental?
I mean, this seems farcical to me because I live abroad, and every time I come back to England and I go to the pub, I feel like I need to take out another mortgage because it's just so ridiculously expensive already. Unless potentially you're going to Wetherspoons. It's already eye-watering. So it does absolutely seem like an attack on the great British boozer, who's been through so much in recent years with the lockdowns, with planning regulations, noise regulations. It's just ridiculous. I don't think there's this, epidemic of people going to the pub to drink their livers away. It seems to be another manufactured crisis. Christopher Snowden has written a lot for our magazine about how much the kind of broad societal harms of alcohol have been and are being inflated. And again, I don't want to be, too broadly contrarian here. When people are genuine alcoholics, that's very sad. But as you say, those people can go to the corner shop and buy a 2-litre bottle of White Lightning anyway, which is not to say we should be raising the price of White Lightning. It just makes it even more groundless to be attacking pubs. And I think it also reflects the busybody culture seeping into the managerial state. We can see it's painfully obvious that Keir Starmer and his advisors, they don't have big ideas for the country. They don't have much imagination about how to turn around the really dramatic social pathologies that are affecting Britain. So they're just engaging in this kind of trivial prohibitionism as an act of just doing something, and also just to flex their managerial muscles. It's quite an embarrassing and degrading spectacle.
Yeah. Okay, so one of the main claims that Starmer has used to justify this smoking ban is that 80,000 people die of smoking every year and that therefore it's a burden on the NHS. Now, that's not actually true because the fact that people are dying earlier actually saves the NHS money. But even if that were true, isn't it kind of a topsy-turvy understanding of our relationship with the state and with the NHS? I mean, you'd think that it's there to serve us rather than the other way round. But does this speak to, a kind of weird mindset here? It's almost as if we're just an NHS with a society attached now.
Well, this is another major thing that we've seen being exaggerated since the pandemic. This idea that, we're there to protect the health service rather than the health service being there to protect us. We're increasingly becoming a health service with a nation attached. Obviously, there's a huge propagandistic element there. As much as the NHS has so many struggles now, it's not a matter of necessity that they're creating these policies. It's more that it's become just a stick to beat people with. If you're saying, how can you possibly complain about these regulations? Don't you care about #OurNHS? For very good reasons, or at least for very understandable reasons, I should say. People do have a very emotional connection with the health system. They can attach it with, relatives who've died. They can attach it to their own personal crises that they've emerged from. It is a very emotional subject. So it becomes a very convenient tool in the rhetorical arsenals of politicians. But it should be seen as just fear-mongering, really. They're trying to raise the spectacle of some kind of crisis of healthcare as a means of justifying pushing people around, when, as you say, there's really no kind of institutional defense for it. Charles Amos wrote an excellent piece recently about how the economic arguments against smoking just don't begin to be justifiable. And it's just a means of turning a kind of public health choice into a bogus public health necessity.
And that draws me on to another question, which is the slippery slope argument. Now, people often deny that this is a thing, but if you look at Canada, say, with euthanasia as another example, is that they brought it in for sort of marginal cases in 2015, and now it's being used in a very widespread way that many people are quite alarmed about. And similarly, back in the noughties, when people campaigned against the prohibition of smoking inside pubs, one of the reasons they said that that was going to be a problem is that it would be actually the road to full prohibition. And of course, nowadays, that's, we seem to be edging further down that road with the ban outside pubs, even despite the fact that so few people nowadays are smoking. So what does this say about sort of the mindset behind these public health initiatives?
Yeah, anyone who calls the slippery slope fallacy a fallacy is just purely gaining their knowledge through Wikipedia, because there's really no rational defense for this idea. We've seen so many cases in which as one policy has justified another policy, which has justified another policy, and so on. I mean, I said, which is true, that I personally can understand and empathize with the arguments for the smoking ban inside pubs, but it has justified this just continual rash of attempts to creep towards total prohibition. Even disposable vapes they're going after now, following on from the Conservatives, which, I mean, officially is supposed to be an effective means of preventing smoking. But anytime there's a new public health regulation, it's just not enough. They're continually stepping over to the next regulation. And I think partly it relates to this kind of busybody culture, but partly it's also just an institutional thing. Once we have all of these public health bodies, all of these quangos, all of these charities, they're constantly looking for ways to justify their own existence, to justify their own status. And so they're always moving on to the next front. I know that you can see it with gambling, you can see it with food, you can see it on so many levels of society, where they're always talking about the latest crisis in public health, the latest new state impositions which need to be brought about. Because if they ever got to the point where they said, actually, people are generally doing fine by themselves, their purpose in life, their institutional purpose in life would be redundant. And obviously, it flies in the face of individual and collective human nature for people to acknowledge this. So they're just going to keep rationalizing reasons to be terrified and reasons for the state to act more.
Absolutely. And obviously you mentioned earlier that this is kind of ground on which Starmer feels quite comfortable as opposed to answering, say, some of the bigger questions of politics and government where they really seem to be struggling, the Labour government. So, what have you made of Labour's, start in office?
I mean, Starmer just seems like God had an experiment to create the most boring human being he could possibly conjure up. He seems to have no imagination whatsoever. Before the election, it was a kind of a running joke that whenever they'd ask him a question about his tastes, his passions, he would say, "No, I don't have a favourite poem. No, I don't have a favourite novel. No, I don't dream at night." And it seemed just like a kind of electoral ploy. He was just nervous about saying something controversial, which it can kind of be understood in today's media environment. But to listen to him just drone on about the state of the world is just to feel like you're drowning in flavourless gruel. It's just depressing. He clearly was blindsided by the riots. That much is understandable, but he just has no kind of substantive response to the national discontent. His only response can be law and order because it's the only thing he knows. He can't grasp the broader national psyche, the broader state of our institutions. He's just going to try and slap down these kind of mole-like pathologies as they pop up. He doesn't have any kind of vision for where the country should be going, I think. He's the ultimate manager. As much as people around him might have this kind of left-wing optimism for redistribution, for diversity, he clearly just would be more comfortable as the boss of a paper box manufacturing factory. He's completely colourless intellectually, apparently completely colourless culturally, and I think there's just a very bleak few years ahead for Britain with him at the helm.
Yeah, and so on that question of the rigidity of his response to the riots, one of the ways that Starmer's been characterised, interestingly, by one of our writers at the Daily Sceptic, Jay Sorrell, is that he's kind of emerged from the back office of Blairism to govern directly. And so if we think about state multiculturalism, for instance, a lot of the political paradigm we're living in took off under Blair. But Tony Blair himself was actually quite a flexible politician, whereas Starmer, it seems, doesn't it, that he kind of can't respond to things other than through this very strict ideological paradigm.
Yeah, as several people have written, and your colleague Jay Sorrell has written very well about this, the Starmerite project is essentially one of depoliticization. Like, Tony Blair, I think, was one of the, just purest manifestations of political evil ever. But at least it was something. He had some kind of ideology. He had some kind of vision. I don't want to quote the Big Lebowski too much, but you couldn't say he had no kind of inspiration behind him. Whereas there's really nothing ideological about Starmer as such, except to taking this kind of Blairite vision and then just formalizing it so strictly in such a kind of pseudo-neutral, pseudo-traditional way that it becomes beyond consent. Something, as we were talking about smoking, just to use that as an example, there's not really any argument for why we need to pursue health as this end goal. It's just accepted as a matter of course. It's public health, it's science, it's hashtag trust the science. It has to be done. And there's going to be no kind of Starmerite worldview articulated, because the essence of Starmerism is you don't really have to articulate the worldview. It's just already there to be imposed and to be institutionalized. And that's why any kind of opposition has to be so loud, so colorful, so florid, because people have to see that it's still possible to be able to question things, and it's still possible to be able to believe in alternative things. And we're not all there just to accept what diktats come from the company man at the top.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. And so finally, in terms of Labour's strategy and Starmer's strategy, obviously we had the Rose Garden speech last week, which was very long, and he speaks almost entirely in platitudes, doesn't he? But anyway, nevertheless, the central message was things are going to get worse before they get better. It's grim, 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 and all kinds of doom and gloom going on there. What did you make of that as a speech? Was it a political ploy? What's going on there?
It's funny how committed he was to the miserabilism. I mean, there's some extent to which it's true that things are going to get worse. And maybe we should resist the temptation to criticize a politician for being realistic, except that the emphasis on things are going to get worse was never really balanced by a sense of, but then things will get better. There were kind of hints towards things are going to get better in the future, but they were very vague. There was no real kind of shape to them. There was no real rhetorical force behind them. It's almost as if he was making being miserable his deliberate aesthetic. It wasn't just a kind of admission to be followed by all the optimism and the ambition for things to come. It was a real commitment to know things are going to get worse, everybody. We all have to come together and accept this. I wonder again if this relates back to the pandemic. One of our authors, Luca Watson, has written a piece about the eternal lockdown of the soul. There was this real sense in the pandemic that things were going to be so awful that we just had to kind of unite and come together and feel our kind of community bonds to carry us through it. And I wonder if Starmer's kind of appealing to that kind of spirit, both as a means of trying to paper over the cracks in British society and as a means of reducing the responsibility of the state to actually improve people's lives by trying to shift the burden, that kind of psychological burden, onto the people themselves, almost reminiscent of Cameron's Big Society. But it was a very, very pessimistic and, again, unimaginative speech. And it was hard to come away from it thinking anything but, goodness me, we need to hunker down and do something, because God knows it's not going to be done for us.
Well, we're all being pressed into Starmer's grand crusade now, aren't we? Whether we like it or not. Okay, well, Ben Sixsmith, thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Laurie. Thanks.
Now, last week, the clothes retailer Next was on the losing end of a 6-year-long employment tribunal over equal pay. Between 2012 and 2023, Next had paid predominantly female retail workers less than warehouse employees, 53% of whom were male. The tribunal found that even though these are different jobs, they ought to have been paid the same, since the work was of equal value. Should Next lose its appeal, it will owe back pay that could amount to up to £30 million. So is it down to judges, not employers, to set wages now? Well, to answer that question, I'm very pleased to be joined by Len Shackleton, Professor of Economics at Buckingham University and a Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Welcome to The Sceptic, Professor.
Hello, nice to be with you.
Good to have you here. Okay, so let's begin at the beginning. What happened in this ruling against Next?
Okay, this is a tribunal case which has been running for about 6 years now, and they've reached a decision which is in favour of the women, the claimants of the almost 1,000 claimants in this case, and it looks as if the ruling means that Next are going to have to pay out a very substantial amount of money in back pay to people who, it's been ruled, have been treated unfairly. This is all to do with equal pay legislation, of course, which rules that people have to be paid the same for work of equal value, even though they're not doing the same job. They're in different places, they're different employment conditions and so forth. But this is a very serious ruling.
Yes. So let's go through some of the details of what was said. So it's been ruled they've been treated unfairly, but that might seem strange given that the judge said that the pay difference was not down to direct discrimination and that there was no, quote, conscious or subconscious influence of gender on the pay decisions. And in fact, there were plenty of women working in the warehouse, 47%. So was this sex discrimination in your view?
In terms of the law, it probably is. What you have here is a situation where something like 75 or 80% of the retail workers for Next were women, and a smaller majority, I think about 52% of workers in the warehouses were men. They picked out, I think, 3 women who were working in retail for Next, and I think 4 men who are working in the warehouse sector. And they're comparing their job sort of line by line. And I've looked through the judgment on this, and it is in excruciating detail, about what people had to do, what they did, what they were required to do, and what they chose to do themselves, and so on and so forth. But this all comes back to the Equal Pay Directive of 1983 in the European Union, which introduced this concept of equal value into English law. Prior to that, there was legislation going back to 1970 about paying people the same for the same work, for the same job, which I think most people would accept. But the idea of pay for work of equal value is a very odd concept indeed. I've argued, in fact, that it's really a kind of bastard version of the labour theory of value, the sort of Marxist idea that people that value comes from the labour input rather than from what the demand is for products and for goods and services. So it's a very odd thing, but we're kind of stuck with it. And this particular case of Next is only one of a number of such cases which have been going on in supermarkets in particular. I mean, Asda is another long-running one, which very, very similar kind of position, where you've got people working in the supermarkets who are mainly, not exclusive, but mainly women, and you've got people in the warehouses who are mainly, but not exclusively, men. And Tesco have also, there's also a case going on against them, a case against Morrison's. And of course, it also applies in the public sector, where we saw, the virtual bankruptcy of Birmingham City Council because of a judgment which ruled that people like refuse collectors, people who are working outside, who are mainly men, were being paid more than canteen workers and so on, who are mainly women. And the basis on which this is done is to have a very detailed consideration of what their jobs entail in terms of the skills required, the degree of responsibility, the degree of autonomy, and so on and so forth. I mean, back in the day, I was involved when I was running a business school in doing an audit of this kind, where we had to bring in outside people and pay them very well to evaluate every single job in the institution and to try to see what balanced with what. And we had to alter the pay scales in order to produce this notion of equal pay for equal value.
Absolutely. And so you mentioned that this idea of an individual sort of subjectively weighing up the value of a job is almost like bringing back Marx's labour theory of value, right? But of course, you're an economist, and economists understand that markets are the best way to allocate wages and prices and things like this. And so, I mean, wasn't the idea that just one individual in a room somewhere should set wages, wasn't that refuted by the fall of communism?
Well, you would have thought so, because, of course, the Marxist labour theory of value ended up with things like paying people more if they're working direct production rather than in the circulation of commodities, like in retail and things like this. And you've got bizarre things like in Moscow in the 1960s, there weren't officially any secretaries because secretary pay was graded lower. And so they had to, all the secretaries had to be called some higher ranking thing in order to be able to pay enough to attract them to do the job. And that's the thing. You see, this approach ignores the role of supply and demand. In the tribunal verdict, they quite specifically rule out the idea that the market for people in warehouses is different from that of people working in stores, whereas in fact there are a very significant differences. Warehouses operate on a 24-hour scale. They're usually in isolated places. There's very little interaction. There's a lot of noise, for example. A lot of people by themselves, isolated, rather than being in a kind of social situation where they're talking to customers and they're talking to fellow members of staff and so forth. All of this stuff is kind of ruled out by the Employment Tribunal, which says, no, you must just focus on what the content of these jobs is. and that can be objectively measured, that we can tick a box and say, yes, this level of skill is the same as that level of skill, this degree of responsibility is the same as that degree of responsibility, and so forth. That's the way the system works.
Yes, it's very strange, isn't it? And so one of the ways that these rulings are often presented is sort of as a win for workers against corporations, the nasty corporations who haven't paid them enough. But, what's your view on whether this kind of ruling are a win for workers overall?
Sure, and they may well be. But of course, what you've already seen in many supermarkets faced with this sort of issue is that they've just reduced the number of people who work in stores by installing self-checkouts and things like this. And indeed, you will find, you're bound to find that businesses, to stay in business, have to accommodate these extra costs, and they'll have to work out ways in which they can save in other directions. I mean, if you were a company starting up doing what Next is doing now, would you, in fact, as part of your organisation, have the warehouses in the in the same system, or would you actually use warehouses owned by a different company to supply your goods and so forth? These are the kind of changes which firms will try to adapt new ways of doing things, and in the long run, it won't necessarily benefit workers.
Absolutely. And would you say that all these hoops firms are now having to jump through to comply with the law is undermining their productivity?
Well, I can't see really how it improves it. There's lots of flim-flam about, workers who feel happier will work harder and productivity will rise and so forth. But the evidence, the hard evidence for this just really isn't there. It's wishful thinking, I think, on part of the advocates of this type of thing.
I mean, one of the strange things about this judgment is, yes, they're supposed to have been discriminated against. But if you take one of these women who's the leading claimant in the judgment, Helen Scarsbrook, she's worked for Next for 20 years. So it wasn't like women couldn't work in the warehouse, was it? 47% of employees in the warehouse were women. So at any point in this time, Helen Scarsbrook could have gone ahead and applied for a job in the warehouse and got it if she was qualified and worked there and then had the higher pay. And then at the same time, from a sort of, more, I can do what I want with my labour perspective and consent, she consented to the job. She said, yes, employ me at this wage rate. So isn't it almost a strange understanding that she's been discriminated against when she freely consented to doing this job?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. From a sort of classical liberal position, I'd have to agree with you. This is so ingrained, though, now into our culture that discrimination is taken almost as synonymous with any difference of outcome. And that, I think, is a very dangerous sort of situation, because there's no limit to the kind of restrictions you can place on the ability of firms to set their wages and set their prices and so forth if you go down that line. So I think we do need to be very careful. And I think one of the things I'm particularly, one of the topics we haven't talked about here is the so-called gender pay gap. And the way in which we currently, all large employers of over 250 people have to produce an annual report on their gender pay gap, and if it's a significant one, what they're going to do about it, how they're going to try and recruit differently and so forth in order to adjust their pay scales and so forth to eliminate this pay gap. Now, what is being proposed actually by the Labour Party at the moment is that this principle be extended to other forms of discrimination. They've mentioned disability discrimination, but also, very significantly, ethnic discrimination. And it appears that we're going to have an obligation, which I think Theresa May wanted, where we have to report the ethnic pay gap every year as well, if you're a large employer, and that creates all sorts of problems, given the huge range of ethnicities which we have within the UK labour market, and the very significant differences between the employment patterns of these different ethnicities. So I think that's something else which is a trouble which is coming up on the horizon.
And just to go back a little bit, I mean, we hear this phrase gender pay gap trotted out quite a lot, but what does that really mean? And is that really a real thing?
Well, the way in which it's conventionally measured, it tends to be measured in hourly pay rates rather than weekly pay rates, because men work longer hours than women, and there are complications in that involved in that way. The Office for National Statistics publishes every year a figure for right across the economy. That is to say, all female workers and all male workers. And there is a pay gap which has been shrinking, but which is significant. However, if you disaggregate this, you'll find that most of this pay gap arises after the age of about 25 or 30. Young women, on some indicators, young women earn more than young men. The gender pay gap, this aggregate gender pay gap, arises because of family formation, having children, taking time out of the workforce, and often also following a very different career path. So that's one issue, which is actually all down to the choices of individual men and women. And although, society has been changing and therefore this gender pay gap has been gradually coming down, this is a completely different thing from the gender pay gap within a firm, which can be for all sorts of reasons. I set my student, because they publish all this stuff, of course, on a government website. I set my students every year an exercise where we pick 7 or 8 different businesses or organizations, and we have a look at why there are pay gaps. And you get some very interesting things, like there are many companies where the gender pay gap is very significantly in favor of women. You get others where it's absolutely neutral. You get others where there is a significant gender pay gap in favor of men. But it's very difficult to pin down exactly the reasons for this. For example, there are huge variations between government departments, where government departments, of course, they have the same HR rules, they have the same civil service rules, and so forth. It's clearly nothing to do with discrimination on the part of the separate civil service bodies and so forth. It's to do with the pattern of employees, what kind of jobs they do, who is recruited to them, and so forth. And it's very difficult, again, for individual organizations to do very much about this. And if you start trying to do something, you actually may create more problems of genuine discrimination, where, for example, you say, oh, we're going to recruit lots of women, and men are turned down, or we're going to recruit lots of ethnic minority workers, and you find that white workers are turned down and they claim discrimination and so forth. So this game about equality and discrimination is a very complicated one. And really, any government which considers adding to this, as the current government is planning to do, I think is gravely mistaken.
And so you mentioned there are various completely innocuous explanations for gender pay gaps in different directions. And that's people's choices, that's employment patterns, that's different things like this. And yet we hear this kind of headline figure of the gender pay gap, and that is essentially used to imply that there's some kind of big discrimination going on. And so how dangerous, therefore, is it to apply these kinds of monocausal, everything is due to discrimination explanations if we bring that into questions about pay disparities between different ethnic groups?
I think it's very difficult, and it could present a lot of problems. There are very significant variations between different ethnicities. White workers are actually paid on average less than Indian and Chinese workers, for example. But Bangladeshi workers are paid much worse than Indian workers. Pakistani workers are paid very badly as well. Black British workers are paid differently from Black African workers, and so on and so forth. So you're going to be able to find disparities between any ethnicity you care to mention. And rather than, the gender pay gap's bad enough, where you've got a kind of binary thing, woman or man, leaving aside transgender issues and so forth, which so far haven't surfaced in this debate, but no doubt they will. But the difference between a binary comparison and a comparison between how many ethnicities in the UK are worth, some people say there's 25, there's 50 or whatever, which are significantly different. There is a tendency, of course, in this situation to lump people together and say, oh, BAME or something, black and minority ethnic workers on the one hand, white workers on the other hand. But that's complete nonsense, because there are such huge differences within these populations that it's just not a valid comparison.
And so in terms of this as a social question as well, won't it be quite divisive to have different groups looking at others' pay packets and concluding that they're being discriminated against?
I think you're absolutely right, Laurie. It will create animosity between groups, and we already have quite enough of that, I think, in both in the workforce and in society as a whole. So, yeah, I think certainly the casual misuse of these statistics, we see this all the time with the gender pay gap stuff, where things are reported. I constantly see reports which say that men and women are being paid differently for the same job. They're not. Right? That's been illegal since 1970. What is argued here is something very different. And that same lack of subtlety will arise to a much greater extent, I think, when we get to comparing ethnicities, where there are already a lot of problems around some of these comparisons.
Yeah, it's a disaster waiting to happen. Okay, well, Professor Len Shackleton, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Okay, thank you.
Now, if you're a Church of England reverend teaching in a Church of England school, you'd think that preaching Church of England doctrine in a Church of England chapel would be a pretty uncontroversial part of the job. Well, not so for my next guest, Reverend Doctor Bernard Randall. Competing Ideologies was the title of the sermon he delivered in 2019 to pupils at Trent College in Nottingham, after being asked by a pupil about all this LGBT stuff. Since then, he's been fired from his job, investigated by the church, and even referred to Prevent. So I'm very pleased to be joined now by Reverend Randall on The Sceptic to tell me about the ordeal he's been through and how he's fighting back. Welcome to The Sceptic, Reverend.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Okay, so this is a long story, but let's start at the beginning, shall we? Take us back to 2019, and it all started with one sermon, didn't it? Tell us what happened.
That's right. So I was a chaplain in a school, Church of England independent school, and the school had introduced a programme through the charity Educate and Celebrate, now defunct, but their programme was to embed gender identity and sexuality in the life of the school, which raises certain questions for someone in a Christian school. And basically one of the pupils said to me, how come we're told we have to accept all this LGBT stuff in a Christian school? Can you talk about that in chapel? And I thought that was a really good question, because it's not about right and wrong. It's about, what are we allowed to think? So I gave a sermon in the chapel saying, essentially, you make up your own mind. You think what you want to think, and you may, if you wish, accept traditional Christian understandings of marriage as only of a man and a woman. You can believe that biological sex is real, can't be changed. Gender identity language doesn't entirely make sense, therefore can't be more than partly true. But most importantly of all, you respect the people you disagree with. And that was always sort of the key. I started and finished with respect to people you disagree with, no excuse for personal attacks or abuse or anything like that. Loving your neighbour doesn't mean you have to agree, but it does mean that you respect their sincerity. So I thought it was quite a moderate sermon. And I mean, people can read it for themselves, or there's a video of me reading a transcript. If you go to christianconcern.com/Bernard, there are links through to lots more about my story, but the video of the sermon is there if people want to see, what were the radical things that I said, or didn't actually say at all, that got me into all sorts of bother, and led to the school leadership. I was sacked for gross misconduct. I was actually reinstated on appeal because they hadn't really gone through the process properly, but with a list of 20 conditions, including censorship of all my sermons, and wasn't allowed to mention anything that might cause anybody upset anywhere in the school. And I had to support all beliefs within chapel and outside, which obviously would include Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Jewish, atheist, or even beliefs of people who were racist or something, I suppose, on the letter of what they said, I had to support, which clearly nonsense. And they reported to me to prevent the anti-terror watchdog and to the local authority designated officer for safeguarding and to the Church of England's own safeguarding authorities, which is the sort of connection to the present set of things going on.
And you say that somewhat matter-of-factly, but of course, not only did you lose your job, you were referred to prevent. That's the counter-extremism watchdog. And this was for a sermon that was in line with Christian doctrine. It was quite straightforward. Were you surprised by that?
Absolutely it did. I mean, I had no idea that they would take it quite as badly as they did. I suppose I had a sense that a few people might ask questions along the lines, why are you saying that? What's with that? Sort of ruffle a few feathers, if you like, at most. But they, I said all sorts of things in chapel services that were equally contentious. For someone to say Jesus is the Son of God is deeply offensive to Muslims, and Jesus died on the cross, deeply offensive to Muslims, and obviously God exists is offensive to atheists. So it was my job as Church of England minister in a Church of England school, in a Church of England act of worship, and so on, to say things like you can accept the Church of England's own teaching. So I really had no sense that it would cause such a kerfuffle of me being reported in all these ways. And then when the COVID lockdowns came, I was made redundant. Ultimately, they said we could do without a chaplain. And they claimed it was financial reasons, but it was fairly transparently, at least to me and others I spoke to, it was just getting rid of this turbulent priest, which is how they viewed me, rather than someone actually in line with the school's own ethos, its own objectives.
Okay, so that was how you were dealt with by the school, but of course the school was a CofE school and you were preaching Church of England doctrine. So did the Church of England have your back in this?
It would be nice to think they would, wouldn't it? But no, absolutely not. Quite the contrary. Having been reported to the safeguarding people at the diocese, which I suppose I can see someone at the school who thinks there's a problem might report it upwards, as it were. But they should have said, well, this is Church of England doctrine, no big deal, nothing to see here, move on. What they actually did was instigate a safeguarding process against me, treating me as a risk, a concern, and I don't know why. And this is one of the enormously frustrating things about the whole thing, is that 5 years on and more, I still don't know why the Church of England, or the safeguarding team in the Diocese of Derby, to be more exact, why they think I'm a safeguarding risk, what the concern is. They've never told me. I keep asking, or have given up asking now, because there's clearly no intention of letting me know. But I've repeatedly asked you, what is the concern? Show me in the guidelines, in the policies, what are we dealing with here? What is the basis of this process? And they've simply refused to give me any meaningful answer to that, or any answer at all, really. So it sort of shifted from, oh, well, it was the contents and manner of the sermon was one thing that was said to me, which is very vague, it's not specific enough. And then it was, well, it's not the sermon, but it's how he might respond to someone coming to him seeking pastoral advice about sexuality and such matters. But there's no evidence that I've ever done anything inappropriate. They say themselves, there's no evidence that Reverend Randall has ever behaved inappropriately to anybody. So this is not an evidence-based process. They are, as far as I can see, making it up as they go along. And as far as I can see, simply because certain people within the structure don't like the Church of England's teaching, which is baffling to me. They can have their personal opinions. That's fine, no problem with that. But professionally, they ought to be upholding the organisation of which they're a part, that's paying their salaries. And they're precisely the opposite.
Yes, and so one of the parts in this saga is your treatment at the employment tribunal. And you mentioned that there was some kind of strange reasoning going on here, where the judge appeared to take issue with the fact that you, in your sermon at this Church of England school, were trying to inculcate Christian doctrine. And she seemed to think that that in itself was a problem. Did you feel that you were treated fairly at this employment tribunal? My
sense of it is that the judgment is grossly unfair. And of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? I recognise that. But if you look at the judgment is, I can't remember, 80 odd pages. There's a lot of it, and they quote all sorts of documents which are on the face of it possibly counter to my case, though fairly tenuous connection, some of them. I mean, one of the things they quote extensively is a letter that another member of staff wrote to me saying, I disagree with your viewpoints. And they don't quote the reply that I sent saying, well, I understand that and that's fine, but here are my reasons. But they quote that extensively as a very peripheral part of the story, I would say. But they don't quote the sermon. They don't put the sermon in any kind of context. So I think there's about 20 words out of the sermon make their way into this massively long judgment when they're quoting paragraphs and paragraphs of other things. So it's as if they've completely ignored the thing that the whole case is actually about. And I would say that's because they know that actually there's nothing really wrong with the sermon, although they say, it's inappropriate to use persuasive language, which is the thing you're referring to there, which is just a bit bizarre, really. And that I went beyond acceptable teachings. Well, point to me where I went beyond anything that is acceptable that doesn't exist. So the whole judgment just felt wrong in the treatment of what I'd actually said, or the lack of treatment of it, frankly. So that was a concern. And then it's since transpired that one of the members of the tribunal panel, because there's a judge and two lay members, one for representing employers, one representing trades unions, effectively for the employees. The trade union representative, we've since discovered, posted some fairly floridly anti-Christian, anti-faith, and anti-conservative party messages on social media, so that he had to be removed from a case that he was hearing subsequently, a different case that was also dealing on Christian freedoms. So him having been removed, and indeed the same judge as heard my case, was also removed herself from that other case because of the perception of bias. So we thought it was biased as soon as we got the judgment. It's now confirmed that there's a good reason to think that there is bias. So I'm absolutely certain that judgment will be overturned when it gets through the appeals process. We're waiting for that to happen next year. So these things, unfortunately, take a very long time, which it takes a toll on you when you're living through it. It's not fun. But we're confident that is going to be overturned and that the school will be shown to have behaved inappropriately. In a sense, the school, most of the people there are not Christian. As a semi-secular organisation, if they get it wrong, well, I can understand it. Disappointing, but so be it. For the church to get it so horribly wrong, that's the thing that, you remember that thing about your mum always saying, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. And that was worse than when she was angry. It's that kind of feeling. I was just so desperately disappointed in the way the church has handled this or failed to handle this.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get into some of the specifics of that. So Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was one of the people who could have, taken up your case or spoken to you or done anything. What has his response been?
I made a formal complaint about the way the safeguarding had been dealt with. I tried to do it through the sort of the local level, complaining about safeguarding, and they just said, well, we don't see any problem with this. We know the procedures weren't quite followed, but basically we're happy with it. So the only thing I could do was make a complaint about the Bishop of Derby, because the bishop is ultimately responsible for all safeguarding in the diocese. So she has ultimate responsibility for the whole thing. She is supposed to be the one who tells me what the concern is. And she's supposed to tell me that in enough detail so I can offer some kind of defence, which is just natural justice. That's her job to do that. And she hasn't. And I've asked her to, and she hasn't. I made a formal complaint through under what's called the clergy discipline measure, which is basically the law that governs Church of England formal complaints about clergy. And when you do that about a bishop, it goes to the archbishop to adjudicate. So Justin Welby was then in a position where he had to look at this complaint and see what to do with it. And his initial response is simply to dismiss it, to say absolutely nothing here at all, which is extraordinary, really, given the kinds of things that I was saying that hadn't happened. The process is not followed. The supervision of the process is by the bishop not happening. And I highlighted the kind of effect it had on me. And I included in it the fact that I felt it was a safeguarding matter, sort of the other way around, that I had suffered abusive behaviour from the bishop and the safeguarding team. At which point, Justin Welby should have passed the safeguarding matter on to the National Safeguarding Team for further investigation. He did nothing. He didn't do it. So he waved it away as nothing to see here. I appealed that, and that goes to a senior church legal officer. And he said the Archbishop had got it plainly wrong. That he went through it, and basically, on sort of 3/4 of the elements of the complaint, he said the Archbishop has got it wrong. You need to go back. And he said it needs to go to formal investigation. And 5 days later, he changed his mind and said, I will send it back to the Archbishop, which was a bit odd. No explanation for that. So Justin Welby has another crack of the whip, as it were. And he said, no further action. There's nothing serious enough here to take any action. So I appealed again, and further, about a third of the elements, the legal officer, Gregory Jones KC, said, no, this is wrong. The case is egregious and the error gross, were amongst his words. That's a very strong, coming from a lawyer type, those are very, very strong words. So sent it back to formal investigation. So it was formally investigated, and at that point, another church legal officer made the next decision, which was, again, there was no case to answer. But her decision is that she's at the same rank as Gregory Jones KC. So this is Sarah Aspin, the president of tribunals, but they're arguing at the same rank, as it were. Therefore, it seems really weird that she should completely ignore her colleagues' determinations that she's already made. Makes no sense. And in all of this, Justin Welby had batted it away. One of the options he had at each stage was to order an attempt at conciliation, to say, there's a problem here, and without apportioning blame on either side, let's try to get the parties together and, with a professional mediator, work out what's going on. And that would have made a huge difference, I'm sure, or it should have made a huge difference. But he didn't do that. So it really felt as if he just simply wanted to get rid of it. It was I'm going to protect a senior colleague, I'm going to protect my bishop, rather than do anything in the interests of justice, or when there are so many safeguarding difficulties in the Church of England at the moment, so many things where the system is going wrong. I would have thought an opportunity to demonstrate this is how we can make the system go well again, he would have jumped at that. But actually protecting the institution, or protecting the individuals within the institution, rather than the wider good of healthy safeguarding in the church, that's how it looks to me. Now, we only know my side of the story in the documents I've seen. So there may be other explanations, but if there had been, and if people had wanted to deal with this sensibly, there are plenty of ways that they could have said, well, we're going to dismiss it, but here's what we're going to do, and got in touch with me and helped me understand how things were going to be made better. And it's the failure to do that, really, that underpins my sense that this is about protecting people rather than actually trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds really hard. I mean, so you've got the original spurious safeguarding complaint against you, and you're actually saying, really, there should be a safeguarding complaint against them for how they've treated you. And then there's this original complaint, which is batted away and batted away again. And then when it finally gets to this senior church lawyer, he says, I think the error is gross. So, that's serious words. I mean, how's that made you feel and how you've been treated by the church?
Well, pretty rotten. You have ups and downs. And so when I saw the reviews by Gregory Jones saying my appeal must be upheld, that was the only time that in the whole process that anybody had taken my side seriously and looked at it and said, there are problems here that are sufficient to take action. Whereas previously there had been sort of vague acknowledgements, oh yes, we didn't quite follow the procedures, but we're still going to carry on with the whole thing altogether. And it's just oh, sorry, we didn't quite follow it. Sorry, it's taken a bit of a long time, but we're still ploughing ahead. Rather than saying, the fact that we didn't follow procedures is really significant. because the procedures are there to protect everybody. They're there to protect the person against whom an accusation is made, but they're also there to make sure that a fair process gets to the fair result for if there was actually a victim of a safeguarding abuse. Now, in my case, there simply isn't. There's never any suggestion that anyone has suffered anything because of what I've done, and nor should there be for a sermon. But, the whole system is there to set up to be fair to everybody and to get a right, just outcome for everybody. So if you simply fail to follow the policy, you are, by definition, being unfair. And I've borne all of that unfairness, and it seems that everybody else's mistakes I have to suffer for, which is, very miserable at times.
Okay, but so now you're fighting back. So you mentioned that when your employment tribunal goes to the appeal stage, that you're expecting to win that because you were treated so obviously unfairly the first time. And then not your employer, but the Church of England, you've decided to take them to judicial review for how they've treated you. Now, tell us about that decision and what you hope to achieve with that.
Yeah, so the point of that is that the complaint process that I went through came to a halt with the decision of the President Tribunals that there was no case to answer for the bishop. But it seemed to me that she had effectively turned 180 degrees from the previous decisions of Gregory Jones, who was making the decisions previously with the rank of President of Tribunal. So you can't have two decision makers of the same level coming to opposite conclusions. Doesn't make sense. And there are various things within the Sarah Aspin's final decision, that aren't right, it seems to me. So she claims that I knew what the safeguarding concern was, but Gregory Jones had already identified correctly, in my view, that I didn't know, and that when the safeguarding team recommended to the bishop that I should have to undergo a risk assessment, there was no evidence that they put forward and no explanation of why there was a safeguarding concern. So what we seem to have is a situation where Gregory Jones says there's no explanation, there's no understanding, no evidence, and Sarah Aspin says, yes, there is. But what's peculiar about that is if I was told at some point in 2019 what the concern was, why is it that by 2021, when this meeting happened that made the recommendation to the bishop, they didn't have any evidence of what the problem was? So it's as if they've forgotten. The people whose job it is to know what the problem is have forgotten what the problem was. That cannot be right. I mean, there's just no way that's true. And so it looks to me as if the decision to halt the complaint process was not right. It was not based on the evidence. And that's the sort of thing where a judicial review hopefully can step in. No one's ever done a judicial review of this body within the Church of England that does clergy discipline. So we'll wait and see whether we're allowed to do it, and if we're allowed to do it, what the outcome of that will be. But my ultimate hope would be that, in my own personal case, that the decision is overturned and my complaint against the bishop goes to a formal tribunal, and they can decide whether there was actually misconduct by the bishop or not, as I think there was, but they might decide, well, that's fine, as long as it's a fair, open process. But I think for my sense, more importantly almost in the judicial review, is if I can do it, other people can too. And the way the Church of England operates at the moment, there's too much that's hidden. There's not enough transparency. You can't always know why decisions are being made. And if the threat of judicial review hangs over some of those decisions, hopefully better decisions will be made. There will be more transparency. And that's actually healthier for the church in the longer run. So whilst there's my personal justice that I hope for, actually a major part of what I'm trying to do here is to make the Church of England better than it is now. Because it can be, when it's working well, a wonderful organisation. And there are faithful clergy and congregations up and down the country doing their very best to be Christian, to preach the gospel, to work for their communities. And their work is inhibited by the central structures looking, frankly, somewhat corrupt. And when people on the outside look in and see the central structures and don't realise their local parish church is actually doing good things, that's no good for anybody at all. So, yeah, whistleblowing is the kind of thing that you're supposed to do to make the whole organisation better. That's kind of how I see myself in this.
Well, let's hope it makes a difference. Reverend Doctor Bernard Randall, thanks very much for coming on.
My pleasure, thank you.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.